by having a pre-lodgement meeting, sometimes you're already starting to negotiate before you've even lodged your DA, the development application. What I mean by that is, let's use a bit of an extreme example. Let's say that you've got a site and you want to do 10 townhouses. Now, it might be that the planning scheme says that as a bit of a generalisation, that the scheme would suggest 6. So if you go in there with 10 as a starting point during your pre-lodgement meeting, and council says no, we'll never support 10, then you go into when you lodge DA, you start at 8, then you've already lost 2 from your negotiation position.
You are listening to the Property Developer Podcast, your home for tips, ideas and inspiration to help take your developing to the next level. Now here's your host, Justin Getty.
Hello and welcome to the Property Developer Podcast. It's great to have you with me. I've got a terrific show for you today as we speak with a town planner about the planning phase of the developing game, and I think you will enjoy it. Before that, a quick update on my townhouse project. The builder is making good progress. They are doing the first fix of all the wiring along the back row of terraces, and they have also started to install some of the shower bases in the bathrooms. The glass windows are on site and will be installed over the coming days. And a guy was there this week washing down the brick walls that have been put up to get all the muck off them, and they were coming up an absolute treat. Check out the latest update video I produced on the show notes for this episode over at propertydevelopmentpodcast.com to see how the bricks look after a clean and how the project is progressing. The front row of terraces are looking good. If you tuned into the last show, I think I mentioned how the framer had accidentally installed the first floor ceiling height 20 centimetres lower than our drawings and was potentially going to have to pull them all down and start again. Fortunately, they managed to avoid having to pull down the frames and instead just added a strip of timber along the top of the frame and attached it all together, which apparently meets the engineer's satisfaction. They've started putting the second level frames in, so it is really starting to take shape and they are starting to come along nicely. And the Water Authority installed our new water main, which looks nice and shiny. So everything is moving along steadily. Now, my other big news is that I've managed to secure my next development site. It is the site I tried to buy at auction a few weeks back, with the property getting passed into me at auction, but then negotiations stalled over the vendor's price expectations. So after a few weeks of back and forth, we finally managed to agree on a figure and I got it stitched up. So I've swung into action and have the arborist going in to remove the trees that don't require a permit. The land surveyor is booked in for a survey and the architect is working on the scheme we will take to council. This is an exciting time in a development project as the architect works up the town planning drawings and the idea starts to become a reality. The plan is to get the planning application into council within 3 months, and I'll keep you posted on how things are going. Okay, on to today's show. I speak with private town planner Craig Christie from ASI Planning about how developers can approach the planning phase of the development process. This is one of the most important parts of the game, as this is where you can potentially set up your project for real success. And obviously getting the planning permit is a big step in reducing the risk of your development. And shortly I'm going to be going through the process myself, and I know what a difference it can make getting council to support your application rather than getting stuck and having to resubmit plans, or worse still, start to lose units. Craig provides some very useful tips about when you should use a private town planner and how to get the most out of them, some great suggestions on handling council objections, and one way you can encourage council planning officers to keep your application moving along. I started off by asking Craig what food he could eat until he was sick, and his answer surprised me.
What food could I eat? Probably lobster. My first experience with eating lobster wasn't until I was in my early 20s, and I just fell in love with lobster, so I think I could eat that forever.
Hey, you've got the poshest answer so far on that
Is
question.
That right? Probably the most expensive taste, so...
Yeah, most people are opting for pizza or chips or other kind of heavy foods.
Yeah, not a big foodie, but lobster definitely does it for me.
Oh, well, lucky you live in an area that is close to the coast and you get lots of good seafood.
Absolutely.
All right, Craig. Well, we're here today to talk about town planning, which obviously is a key element of the development process and something that developers are always very interested in, particularly getting approval for what they want. Can you give us a bit of a background on yourself and how you got into town planning?
Yeah, sure. I was born and raised in Western Sydney. Got to that age where you just had to finish high school. Everyone sort of puts pressure on you about what you're going to do for the rest of your life. I honestly had no idea, but I looked up different degrees, and town planning was appealing because it was like a professional job where you could be indoors and outdoors, and I really love the outdoors as well. So that was appealing, and did my degree down in Western Sydney, Hawkesbury, which was a 3-year degree. And since then, I've worked for a number of different councils, number of different councils in Sydney, but also moved up to Queensland about 10 years ago, and been doing town planning for the last sort of 10 years up here in Queensland. And mate, yeah, enjoy doing town planning, enjoy running a business, and enjoy helping people get great outcomes.
So tell me, how does someone become a town planner? What kind of skills do you need? And why would you get involved in the profession?
Yeah, it's one of those things where I don't think anyone wakes up as a 6-year-old kid and says to their daddy they want to be a town planner when they're older. I think it's not really high on the list. Generally speaking, on behalf of myself and a lot of people who work for us, a lot of geography backgrounds, but also I think what's really like, generally you do a 3 or 4 year degree, but the aspects of town planners that I think that I see coming through a lot, particularly in assessments, is people who love to get great outcomes and love to negotiate. I love negotiation. We were talking earlier a little bit about negotiation, and I love it. I love just trying to work out the best way of getting the best possible outcome for our clients, and being able to work out a way of positioning ourselves so that we get the best possible outcome that council would support.
And what do you say to people who make the claim that town planners are just frustrated architects?
I've never actually heard that one. So, what would I say? I would say that I've never heard that.
Maybe that's just for the town planners that work in
Oh,
council.
of course. No, I know what you're talking about now. Yes, I can relate to that. Sometimes when we're at council, Sometimes when we're at council, the town planners from council start to think they're architects, and they start doing, why don't you do this, why don't you do this, and it's all, well, that's all great, but what about the fact that you just completely destroyed the profitability of the project or whatever it may be? So I think town planners should stick to what they're good at, and definitely leave the drawings to the professionals.
Yeah, well, we might come back to that, because that's the bane of a developer's a relationship with a council town planner, is that they do start saying, change that facade, change that material.
I've seen some examples where sometimes it can work. I've certainly been in meetings where the town planners come up with some suggestions that's gone way outside of what we expected them to say. I think if you position the meeting well, sometimes you get council, if you give them enough rope, they'll sometimes give you answers that you're kind of leading them towards, but they come up with a solution themselves, and therefore they're more connected to that solution. So it's like their idea and they're more supportive of that. So I've seen situations where that can work as well.
And so when you say that council or the planners should stick to what they know as opposed to sort of drawings, what is it that they should know?
Well, I guess there's 2 different types of town planners. So if you look at council town planners, ultimately what council does is they write the rule book. And the rule book is their planning scheme, and their planning scheme is like a performance-based scheme. So therefore, the rule book typically says if you do this, A, B, and C, you should get approval. And if you don't comply with A, B, and C, you should consider what the impacts are to see whether they're reasonable. I guess what I mean by that is, let's say, for example, you had a property that had a requirement for a 6-metre back rear boundary setback. And now if you do that, then you fully comply. It should get approved. Sometimes there's good reasons why setbacks less than that should be okay. And that might be that the reason it's 6 metres is to protect privacy of rear properties, but you might back onto a park or a reserve or whatever, in which case planners should then consider, well, who's going to be impacted by the development. I've always thought a lot of town planners overcomplicate the process. Ultimately, council's planners are there to check to see whether it complies with the scheme, and if it doesn't strictly comply, is someone going to be impacted by the variation to that scheme, and is that reasonable? And that's kind of the gist of it. And likewise, as a private town planner, our goal is to try and walk that grey line between, obviously something that fully complies is a no-brainer, something that's grossly non-compliant probably won't get supported. So we're trying to find that balance that is what I call council's least acceptable, least desirable acceptable outcome. So we're trying to find our most acceptable desirable outcome. We're trying to find what the best thing we can do for the site is, and council's trying to work out what they consider, well, that's okay, we can live with that. So I think it's negotiation to find that point.
Well, in my experience, if only council planners were there sort of ticking off against the planning scheme, that would be a good thing. But
that's interesting. See, I'm Brisbane, you're Melbourne as well, so I can't speak on behalf of what happens that much in Melbourne because I'm not that familiar with how town planning kind of goes down there. So it might be state to state, you get different experiences. But yeah, they're interesting.
Well, the other challenge in Melbourne is that there's a lot of different councils. So I know in Brisbane you have just one big council. In
That's
Melbourne,
right.
there's quite a few of them spread across the city, so it makes it
Yeah.
pretty challenging.
And Sydney's the same. Sydney, I used to work in North Sydney Council, and there's a lot of councils in that area, so you get a lot of variations to rules, and it's very hard to remember them because there's so many of them.
Yeah, so I guess that raises a point that I've always pondered is that if you engaged a good designer, whether that's an architect or a drafter who's pretty familiar with the local council and what they want, shouldn't they be able to help you as a developer navigate your way through and come up with a solution that sort of maximizes the site?
And the answer is, then in many cases, yes, they should. And what I mean by that is you don't have to have a town planner. There's nothing that says your application has to be lodged by a town planner. What we often find with the designers we work with, the better designers work really closely with us for a couple of reasons. One, they're wanting to better understand the fine print, how to try and almost like look at the controls and how to try and get an outcome which isn't quite in the grey area of those controls. But also, I think town planners, I often say we're here to find all the problems before we find all the solutions. And what I mean by that is if a client, let's say you were to call me with a property, the first thing I'd be looking at would be what can possibly go wrong. Are there overlays? Does it affected by flooding? Is it all those? Are there engineering issues? And what we typically find is designers, whilst they're good at design, may not have enough rounded knowledge around those other aspects. And you might find yourself buying a development site with a great design, only to then work out that there's a servicing issue that can't be overcome, and you've got a site which can't be developed. So really good designers are really good at designing, but I think town planners have a bit of an understanding of all aspects of planning, such that we look to make sure people don't buy sites that just can't be developed the way they think they can be developed, and therefore they don't lose their money because they've overestimated what they think they can do.
Yes, which is a problem. So how can a developer get the most from a private town planner? I guess that's what you describe yourself as, wouldn't you?
Yeah, we work privately. So I think the way to get the most out of your private town planner is first of all, ask lots of questions. I often get people apologising for asking lots of questions, and I say, no, don't do that. Ask lots of questions, because I don't know where you're at. One of the questions I'll often ask a developer will be, is this your first project? Because I want to understand where they're coming from, so I can better understand how to answer their questions. But the way to get the most out of your town planner, a few things. One is always be educating yourself at the same time. Whilst it's good to have that knowledge within the town planner, it's also good to have your own knowledge. And sometimes if you've owned a site for a long time, you know your site better than the town planner ever possibly could. So the town planner might not know things about that site. Like it might be that council says, there's too much traffic on this road, you need to provide access from an alternative point. But because you know the property, like, well, no, that's not true. So a lot of that knowledge about a particular site can be brought into the project. But also, I really encourage people to challenge their town planner. If they're getting told something by their town planner that doesn't quite fit right or feel right, then ask them why they say that, and just keep challenging them, because ultimately your project is your baby, and whilst as a town planning business we deal with over 200 applications a year, we want to give each individual application utmost attention, but sometimes I get questions from my clients like, oh, that's a great question, let's look into that. So I guess I'd always say listen to your town planner, but also just see if it makes sense and challenge them if it's not quite making sense to you. But I guess even in choosing a town planner, try and find someone with that local knowledge that's got a lot of experience doing the types of projects you're wanting to do.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. Well, not so much finding one, but perhaps filtering them out. What are the kind of questions that a good developer could be asking a town planner to figure out whether they know what they're on about?
Yeah, I guess the point I make there is don't be embarrassed to ask challenging questions. I think sometimes I'd be asking questions like, so let's say you're doing a subdivision project, for example, you might speak to the town planner and say, when was the last time you got a subdivision project like this approved, and how many do you do these a year? And how many people work for you? Those sorts of questions. So what I find, I don't think I'm a genius, but I think because I've been doing it for so long and because we've got a high volume of applications, I get so many experiences. And as a result of so many experiences, then we're pretty much always up to date with what council's position is with their planning scheme. So if things change, like we had a situation in Brisbane recently where council were reinterpreting their own scheme, and we were the one of the first two to find out. So in a really bad sense, because it really messed up one of our projects. But if you're a a planner that was a bit quieter, you might not know for 5 months that planning scheme, that part had changed, where someone who's got a high volume will be more up to date with the changes in the scheme.
That's a good point, because I know people who've had the experience where council has changed their interpretation of their own planning scheme. Why would they do that, and what are the implications for you as a developer about that?
I'll first say it's a horrible situation. We've only been kind of burnt by it once, and it was quite painful. Why did council do that? I think what happens is, this is my belief, and at some level that council cops so much backlash about one of their schemes or an approval. There might be an approval somewhere, and it might be for political reasons that the public get upset about that approval, and then council go about seeing how they can reinterpret their scheme to stop those approvals from happening further. And in which case, the logical thing would be that council has to change their scheme, but sometimes they just say, well, no, we're interpreting our scheme differently now. And we've had some times where you just shake your head and you think, how is it they can interpret their scheme that way? It's beyond belief. But at the end of the day, they make the rules, and unless you're heading off to the court system to try and challenge them on those rules, you've got to, and then again, you're going to have the expenses of doing that. You have to try and deal with those changes as best you can. So as a business, we try and keep council accountable as much as possible to their own rules. And it's just tricky. It just really is extremely frustrating.
Yeah, I might come back to heading to a tribunal shortly.
Sure.
But if you are having problems with a council, what kind of things would you do? Because I don't think it's uncommon to kind of not be on the same page as council. You've got an idea as a developer about how you can maximise the site. They've got an idea as a council about what's best for what they perceive to be best for the local community. And maybe how do you get closer together?
Well, I'll take a step back, because I often hear the public and also other town planning firms complain about council and whinge about council. In some ways, I just had a whinge then as well, but that was a reinterpretation of their own scheme. I think sometimes what happens is that the public or some planning firms, they don't know the scheme so well as to work out what they believe even before buying a site's possible. And then sometimes they buy a site, but they pay too much for the property. And next thing you know, they're effectively doing whatever they can to get a yield that the scheme never really would have encouraged in the first place. So it's through lack of knowledge about what the scheme wants in the first place means they've purchased the property paying too much with an expectation of a higher than expected yield. And then you're kind of reeling from that point on. Everything you're trying to do is trying to effectively break council's rules. So I think the first thing is even before you buy a property, make sure you have a worst case scenario position, and be confident that your worst case scenario is something that's realistic, that council would support. Pretty much, you pretty much know that. Beyond that then is when you're pushing the boundaries a bit. And I was talking to a client a few days ago about sometimes it's a personality clash. So sometimes you just got to be careful about whether the town planner you're engaged in is coming from a place of butting heads with council. I had a really good experience when I was starting town planning nearly 20 years ago down in North Sydney. One of the manager of planning back then, I was with him my first 2 weeks of being at council, and we had 2 pre-lodgement meetings with the public. And this first developer came in, and he was quite cocky and quite arrogant. And I basically saw my manager just chew him up and spit him out, something chronic. He just got hammered. And then the second client come in, and they were very open to the idea of suggestions and asking questions and being quite amicable. And I saw that same manager who spat out the previous client helping this developer, working out solutions to problems they didn't even realise they had. So I learned from that you don't always have to be logheads with council. You just got to understand what their desires are and what their needs are, and try to work out how you can best achieve what they want with what you want to find that point that's the best outcome you can possibly get for your client. End of the day, council can refuse your application, and if they do, you got to go to court, but you're going to spend a lot of money, so you want to do whatever you can to try and avoid that expense if possible.
This is where a good town planner should be able to sort of tiptoe through the minefield a little bit. Yeah,
exactly. And it's like, I think in a lot of ways the majority of the work for us anyway, in my mind, is done even prior to the person purchasing the property, even before the contract goes unconditional. Because once it goes unconditional and once you're committed to that deal, you're kind of stuck with a good or bad deal. So it's really important that you're able to understand what's possible with a site, and that way the client can do their feasibility based on that, and know that their worst case scenario is they're going to do okay. Best case scenario, they do very well. But you just want to make sure you get a worst case scenario position that works for everyone.
Yeah, and then in terms of, do you recommend having pre-app meetings with councils?
Great question. That's a really good question. I answer it two ways. It depends.
Yes and no?
Yes and no. I'd say it depends. I'd say what I mean by that is, let's say you're about to buy a property and there's a critical aspect of the site that you really need to understand. And if you can't overcome that critical aspect, you won't buy it. Then I'd recommend having a pre-lodgement meeting, because the reality is you want to know whether that issue is going to be so big that you can't overcome it. But if you already own the property, or you're already committed to the project, by having a pre-lodgement meeting, sometimes you're already starting to negotiate before you've even lodged your DA, the development application. What I mean by that is, let's use a bit of an extreme example. Let's say that you've got a site and you want to do 10 townhouses. Now, it might be that the planning scheme says that as a bit of a generalisation, that the scheme would suggest 6. So if you go in there with 10 as a starting point during your pre-lodgement meeting, and council says no, we'll never support 10. Then you go into when you lodge DA, you start at 8. Then you've already lost 2 from your negotiation position, and the public only ever sees the one you've lodged with 8, not 10. So sometimes if you lodge it with 10, you're starting from a stronger negotiation position, and then the public see how much work council's done to negotiate it from 10 down to 8. As opposed, does that make sense? It becomes more of a starting point. But I always say to clients, it's a bit of a game, and you've got to work out how you want to play the game. It's going to take longer to do it that way. It's going to be more costly because of design fees. But yeah, it's just a matter of working out how to play that game.
Yeah, that tends to be my view. If you understand the scheme, the area, which you should, if you're a good developer, then you should have a pretty good idea about what is possible.
Yeah.
And beyond. And then I tend to think, if you know that, then going to council and sort of saying to them, this is what we're thinking of doing, I just don't see a tremendous amount of benefit in doing that.
It's ultimately, if you don't have a really big question to ask, then what's the purpose? So some people say, well, why don't we just go and visit council? I'm like, well, that's great. Why? Well, don't we want to just meet with them? Yeah, cool, but why?
I want to have less dealings with them as I can.
Yeah, and sometimes you say, well, it builds rapport, and it's not, depending on the scale of the project. If it's a publicly sensitive project, and you know council are generally in support of it, but you kind of start working together. We've got a medical centre we're doing. It's quite a large medical centre. And we knew we had public support by council, but we wanted to work out together how we can negotiate that process. So therefore, we sort of met with council to kind of work as more of a team. But that's not always the case. So yeah.
Yeah, I just think if you know what you can do, don't alert them to your highest and best use at the start.
Yeah.
Go in with what you want, and then sort of work back from there.
And there's something that I'm not sure in sort of other states, but in Queensland, there's a process, particularly in Brisbane, called Risk Smart, and it's basically whereby if you do low risk, more so fully compliant applications, we can get something like 10 townhouses approved in just 5 days. So if that's where you want to go with things, then you say, well, do you want to meet with council beforehand? Well, maybe you do if it means the difference between getting a 5-day approval and getting a 3-month approval, and you've got some little parts you want to tweak up, then maybe it's worthwhile meeting with council first to make sure you're going to get through really fast.
Okay. Now, when you're there considering an application that's going in, when you're preparing your report, what are the kind of key considerations that you immediately look for? Things that jump to my mind would be neighbourhood character, visual bulk, maybe whether height's compliant. Yeah. What other things, or am I on the wrong path?
No, I think you're on the right path. Basically, I always look at it. My starting point is what's the black and white. Typically in planning, nothing's really black and white, but we try and work out what are the black and white parts. So it might be that we comply with, say, 60% of the scheme around certain aspects. So that part's the part that council can effectively look at and tick boxes and say, yep, you comply. It might be number of car parking spaces or height or whatever it may be. And then you get the grey area. And as soon as you get the grey area, it might say, we encourage 2 stories. And if you want to go to 3 stories, then that's obviously the grey area, and that's the area you really want to give all your attention to what it is that we think we can justify why we should be able to go to 3 stories. And that might be what's happening in the area, other developments that have been recently approved. It might be because the neighbours are a long way off the boundary, or they're different uses. So I think the general gist of it is get the black and the white out of the way as quickly as possible, so then you can put majority of your argument in and majority of your time into those aspects that need the most of your time to get council support.
Yeah, and I think that's where a private town planner is actually really useful, because they can then also point out the things that you could possibly apply for dispensation or for council to waive, things like whether you need an additional visitor car space. Because I know we had that waived on our current project. Instead of having 4, we asked them for 3, and they let it through.
Yeah, and a lot of that will be to do with, it might have been proximity to public transport, or availability of parking in the street. Like the black and the white was perhaps you needed 5 spaces, but the grey was, well, there's probably a reasonable justification here for less spaces, and these are the reasons. And it's not that hard typically. You think about it, well, if we're going to ask for less visitor car parking, that means that one more car can't park on site. Where will it park? Will it park in the street somewhere? Is there parking in the street? So even a non-town planning developer can look at that and say, okay, what do we think in common sense terms, what sort of things do we need to try and use to try and justify not complying?
Yeah, which was weird, because they had asked us to change 2 of our 3-bedroom properties down to 2-bedroom ones.
Yep.
And to reduce the number of car spaces, the number of cars on site. They wanted to reduce car parking demand, so they said, we'll change your 3-bedders down to 2-bedders.
Yep.
And you get rid of 2 cars.
Yep.
And I said,
yeah,
but those people are going to have cars, and they're going to need to park there somewhere. So how does it actually reduce the on-site demand? It just shifts it somewhere else.
No use, if council are telling you what you want to hear, there's no use arguing with them.
Well, no, I just said to them, I don't understand your logic on this, but I'm not going to fight you on it. If that's what you want, we'll give it to you, but it just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and sometimes things don't, we scratch our head. If at the end of the day, if it doesn't make sense to us, but it's, it doesn't really have an impact on the development, or some ways it means getting an outcome we want to get, then you just scratch your head and let it go. But if obviously it gets in the way of what you want to do, then that's when you're going to argue that point further.
Have you got any other tips for how you can deal with council when you're going through your application process?
Yeah, definitely. We talked a bit about doing a pre-lodgement meeting. At the end of the meeting, what I try to do is make sure that everyone's on the same page. And what I try to do is make sure that, I might say, so just to finish up our meeting, can we just make sure we both agree to like A, B, C, D, and just do like a verbal minutes of the meeting, so that way there's no misunderstandings, and there's no way that council can kind of backtrack on what they've said and then later on say, well, we didn't say that, when you've got really clear notes and a really clear discussion to that point. And
would you email that to them saying, here's my recollection of the meeting, or here's the notes that we took that we agreed upon?
Yeah, you could email them to council. It'd be even better if you got them to council before they did their own meeting minutes, because they may reflect that in their own meeting minutes as well. But yeah, it can be really frustrating if, like, I think council can be really good at not answering questions, and they can be really good at trying to avoid making statements. So just trying to gently corner them so they're making statements you can actually start to make decisions based on.
Yeah, they are very good at being evasive. Until you actually put something into them, and then they tell you what they don't like about it.
Yeah.
And then what about councillors? Because you have the statutory planning department.
Yeah.
And then what happens when it sort of moves over into the political side of the council and councillors start to become involved? What happens there, and what can you do about it?
We typically, every council has a situation where the councillors have what they call call-up powers, and call-up powers basically just means that a councillor can say, I want this application to go before a council meeting for a council decision, as opposed to under delegation, whereby the town planners have the ability to make the decision. And effectively what happens then is you go from one arena, which is, does it comply with the planning scheme and how's it in a planning sense, to then move into a political sense. And then you've got, within that councillors, you might have a political, you've got Liberal Party or Labor, whatever they want to do to position themselves in that kind of hierarchy. And next thing you know, you're perfectly good projects going south fast, because some councillor knows a neighbour of knows someone who knows someone, and it shouldn't be that way, and it's not meant to be that way. Whether it is or not, I don't know, but you certainly don't want to, if possible, get into that sort of counsellor space. But also, I guess in some ways you can use that to your advantage as well, and that is you might want to, even at the earliest point of a project, start to talk to the counsellor to see how pro-development they are, and if they're pro-development, sort of introducing your idea of the project to them to try and get their support for what you're wanting to do with your project.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I haven't been involved with that personally. I've sort of seen it touched on with another colleague, but I can imagine it would get pretty messy when the politicians start getting involved.
And even to the point, sometimes you see that the manager of planning just looking at you, like, almost shaking their head, thinking, I've seen that in a meeting once. I had a town planning manager look at us, and they just, they're like, oh my God, I can't believe where this council is. Like, they're effectively they're mums and dads themselves, the councillors. Whilst they might be far more knowledgeable about planning than the average mum and dad, they sometimes don't really understand what they can and can't do under the act we work under, and they start doing things which are a bit out there. So it can be a difficult course to travel.
And then what about dealing with, say, junior planners versus senior planners or managers, and how would you go about accessing, say, a senior planner if you had a sort of bigger project and you just didn't want to muck around with talking to a junior planner, you really wanted to be dealing at the start with someone who was probably going to make a decision?
Yeah.
Is there a way of influencing that?
Yeah, usually if it's depending on the scale of the project, if it's a pretty basic project, you're probably going to get put with a more junior planner. And if it's a no-brainer, then you're probably not going to have a problem with that. But if it starts heading south, usually you would politely ask who their delegate is or who their team leader is, and just ask if you can speak to that team leader. Obviously, that to some extent starts to break a relationship a bit with that more junior planner. But at the end of the day, you got to do what you got to do. And if it means getting into that more senior level to try and better understand, because they're ultimately the decision makers, it's the highest level. So I'd always recommend if it's not sort of heading the way you want it to or you're concerned about it, is just politely ask them who their manager is and say you just wanted to run a few things past them as well. But yeah, it's tricky because sometimes we've had situations whereby junior town planners have been quite supportive, and we thought we were going fine. It gets to a higher level, and all of a sudden we start seeing problems, and it's wow, didn't expect these problems to be arising.
Yeah, well, I think that's my point. These more senior people start going, no, can't do that. And if you've just been dealing with them from the start, you would have known.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then what about, is there any way of influencing getting your application in front of a planner that you've dealt with before who's familiar with how you go about doing things?
Usually not. Well, it depends. If it's what you'll typically find is that councils are broken up into different areas. They might have a north team, a south team, east and west team. So if you're doing a development that's very comparable to one you've already done, it's probably quite possible you'll fall back in the same planner's lap because councils, senior planners or managers will know that they've already dealt with another project. So more times than not, out of luck, that you get put in the right hands. As far as influencing that, I don't really know if council would be too warm to you telling them who you want to have assess their application, because it could be sort of seen as favoritism. So it's kind of a tricky spot where you just kind of, we've got certain projects whereby we work with the same planner every single time because of the nature of the projects. We've got such a close relationship with that planner now, and it just makes life so much easier. But as far as trying to choose who it is from council you want to have a look at your project, I don't think that's really that achievable. What I'm a big believer in is having absolute control all the time. And what I mean by that is that if you do something with council, let's say that you have a conversation with council and they say they're going to do something, you might say, let's say they say, well, I'll have a look at that and I'll get back to you. I just say politely, oh great, when do you hope to get back to me by? And they might say, well, next Wednesday. Cool, because typically people will come back with a time frame. When you actually ask that question, they feel a bit embarrassed to go to a longer time frame. So they might say, well, next Wednesday. And you might say, cool, if I don't hear from you by Wednesday, do you mind if I touch base with you on Thursday? Yeah, sure. So what you're doing is you're kind of keeping them accountable to their own time frames. And therefore, when it's Tuesday or Wednesday, they're like, wow, you might get up the priority list because they know they've made a promise to you. So always politely get them to give time frames. That way you can keep them accountable to their own time frames.
Oh, yeah, that's a good tip. Good idea. And so tell me, what's some of your war stories, maybe some of your biggest, maybe not failures, but the strangest things that you've tried to get through that got knocked back?
Yeah, I haven't had too many strange ones. I guess the most frustrating one, as I was kind of referring to earlier, was whereby It was a very basic project. It was just for effectively a two-lot subdivision with two small lot houses, the way the council were interpreting their scheme, and they just changed the way they interpret it. So all of a sudden, without going into lots of details, the profitability of the project just got smashed. So that was the most difficult situation we kind of dealt with in recent times, because, yeah, what do you say to a client when all we can do is go back and say, hey, council, for whatever reason, are now interpreting their scheme differently, and we're going to try and pressure them as much as we can to maintain the position they had when we first lodged it, but this is where they're at. So that was, really disappointing. I guess I hate nasty surprises, and for us that was a nasty surprise, and for the client that was a nasty surprise. So I guess probably the worst outcomes. Fortunately, we haven't had too many bad outcomes, but there've been times when either one or two things, council changes their planning scheme, or sometimes we've got another project with about 50. Or not quite, but close enough, 50 objections to it. So when there's a lot of public objection to a project, it gets very political, and that can get quite difficult and nasty as well.
Yes, that's a good segue into objections and how you A, handle them, and then B, how do you perhaps avoid them in the first place?
Yeah, so how you can avoid them in the first place is sometimes, depending on the site, if you talk to neighbours and start to build a bit of a relationship with them. I wouldn't always recommend doing this, but if you're good at building rapport, you can actually start showing them what you want to do in advance. They see that as a polite thing to do, and they don't get a surprise letter in the mail about the project. That might help reduce the amount of submissions.
I did that on this current project. I did that when we were going through the planning phase.
Yeah. Did it work, do you think? Do you think you did the right thing in hindsight?
Yeah, I think it did. I mean, we got 3 objections in the end, which was a pretty substantial development in the end that was being put on there. We started off with 10 and then went to 14 and then ended up at 20.
Yeah.
But I went around and dropped off letters to the neighbours.
Yeah.
Just letting them know that this is what we were planning on doing, and I kept doing that along the way.
There's a downside of doing that, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. The reason that doesn't sometimes is you give the neighbours more time to get organised.
Yep.
In which case you're kind of giving them more opportunities to be prepared to object to your development. So I'm not convinced it's always a good strategy. It's kind of tricky. I guess you'd want to sort of somewhat suss the neighbours out before you go and tell them what you want to do. I'm still yet to be convinced either way is a better strategy. It's just tricky.
Yeah, my view on that is that people are going to, if they're going to object, they're going to do it anyway.
Yeah.
Whether they've got enough, well, they're always going to have enough time because they get notification and they get whatever the period is, so they've always got some time, but it's better to get it to know early what you're going to be dealing with.
And you can typically, like, for people who have things like, I don't know if people got Price Finder or things like that, they can sometimes work out who their neighbours are and whether they own multiple properties, because you start realising, well, my neighbour to the left's a developer as well, my neighbour to the right's lived there for 20 years. It's not hard to work out where your issues are going to probably come from.
Yeah, okay. All right, so that's a way that you can avoid it. What about when they come?
When they come,
particularly when you get quite a lot.
I'll start with, let's say you weren't getting quite a lot. Sometimes we just talk to council and we just say, council, hey, there's been a few submissions here. We think all those areas have been dealt with within our application. Do you think we need to respond to these or not? And sometimes I'll say, no, it's fine, don't bother. Which is kind of their way of giving us a little. It's a bit of a tokenistic way of they're showing support for the proposal. So we do that to kind of sort of gain momentum in the direction of support. If they say, yeah, you really should write a submission here, we're really quite concerned about these objections, and you're like, oh, okay, we're really concerned about that. So as a town planner, when we receive lots of submissions, we typically check with council whether they expect and want us to respond to them, because we don't always do that. If we do, we then just summarise those objections and try to respond in a way that helps council respond to those neighbours. So I guess our mindset is that we believe council wants to approve our application as well. We just need to help them and give them information that's going to help them respond to people who've made submissions to the project.
Yeah, so how does that work when you then put in a response to the objections that goes to council? Do they pass those on to the objectors, or do they
it's all public.
Use that to inform their response?
It's all public information. So the council would keep on record that there were the submissions, and they would keep on record our response to those submissions. And typically then they would look at both aspects of both the submissions and also our response to whether they still are going to consider supporting the application or not.
Yeah, actually, I remember when we got supplied with the objection letters from a couple of people that objected to our development, and I went to ring the council planning officer about them,
Yeah.
and somehow in the email, I actually rang the objector.
Oh no.
And he picked up the phone, and I said, I'm looking for so and so from the council, and he said, oh no, you've called someone else, but I've got his name and number here somewhere on this letter. And he goes, hang on, I'll go and get it. And so then
You're like, oh my God.
And then kind of the penny dropped, and I went, oh, are you Mr. So-and-so? And he said, yes. I went, oh, this is Justin. I'm the developer that's doing the development that you've objected to, and you've written a letter saying you've got concerns about flooding and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And so I ended up having a conversation with him, and his concern was around flooding with overland water flow with all the extra driveway. And then when I explained to him that there would be an on-site retention system and that would capture all the water and there wouldn't be any overflow and things like that, he was actually quite happy with that.
And you usually find that a lot of times the submissions, sometimes they're based on things that council can't really put weight to, and that is you're devaluing their land. So the council's not in a position of working out whether developments devalues or increases values of neighbouring properties. Sometimes you get complaints about things like overland flow, and they're concerned about that. But the reality is, if you're putting more roof structure that's getting captured and directed to a legal point of the street or wherever it's going to go, you're actually likely to reduce the impacts, not increase them. And it's just lack of knowledge. And usually council gets that. What I guess the most concerning objection that we see is if we don't comply with an aspect of the development scheme, example, height, and someone says, as a result of the height, this is what the impacts are to them, and you're like, yeah, I can kind of see what they're talking about. They're the ones you're like, oh, it's going to be really hard to argue this point because we don't comply, and we need to show that our non-compliance isn't unreasonable, and they're raising some pretty good reasons why it's going to be a pretty big impact to them. So they're the kind of submissions where like, oh, this is going to get tricky.
Yeah, well, I just had some friends, actually a previous guest on the show, John Marquez, whose application got knocked back, and they had their neighbours on their proposed site were pretty vociferous about not wanting any development in their court. They ended up going to the tribunal, and they ended up, they lost. So council rejected their application, and then the tribunal upheld that decision and basically said, due to neighbourhood character, they weren't going to approve the proposal.
Yeah.
Not that it necessarily didn't comply with the scheme, but it was more around neighbourhood character.
Often that's somehow tied into the scheme. Again, not knowing every scheme across Australia and Melbourne alike, but the way schemes are written in Queensland is they typically have the standard planning controls, and then they'll typically have a neighbourhood character plan, which talks about in specific areas what the expectation is of those individual areas. Not always, but often I'll have those particular controls, and they've seen as being more significant than the general controls.
Yeah, well, interestingly enough, there was another developer across the road on a similar sized site who was tailing behind them. And
really?
he ended up, his proposal also got rejected.
Yeah.
But he reduced the density on his site following some of the sort of feedback from my friends across the road.
Yeah.
Council rejected that application. He then went to the tribunal and he actually had it overturned. So he succeeded, and the tribunal member put in their decision that neighbourhood character was not really grounds for knocking back the application because council had zoned it for change. So
who would want to be a property developer? Hey, all these crazy listeners becoming property developers. It's definitely a tough gig, and I have absolute admiration for them because there's so much uncertainty, like you just mentioned. One person seems to get in trouble and get their application refused, while the next person with a little bit of variation gets it approved. So, it's a tricky minefield of a process.
Yeah, well, I guess it was just going to that point that you made about councils interpreting their own schemes to fit whatever their feeling is on the day or the week or the year.
Yeah.
So, and I think a lot of that comes back to community feedback.
Yeah.
On change. And
that's it. So let's say, again, I'll sort of touch on this building height thing a few times, but we'll stick onto that particular control. Is if you didn't comply with the heights and there was no submissions, council kind of knows they're not being kept accountable to such a high level. And what I mean by that is if they approve it, they know that they haven't got that neighbour complaining about them not following their own scheme or whinging about the fact that they made a submission about height and council ignored them. So it's obviously a lot easier to get things approved when there's no submissions.
Yeah, so if you do end up having to go to a tribunal, have you got any tips or advice about best ways to prepare or how to go about that?
Yeah, again, it's different state to state. We have without prejudice meetings in Queensland, and I imagine they may have something similar in Melbourne as well, whereby the general intention is to try and resolve issues before it actually gets into a courtroom. And the point being in those without prejudice meetings is just to really listen to counsel. It's always about negotiation, and I think always the first point of negotiation is to try and really clearly understand what the problem is without trying to argue, get real clarity and what the major issues are. And once you can isolate those issues, start responding to them. But also a little trick that we did once was we had a list of issues that council raised, and there was about 25 issues, which is quite a long list. Anyway, when we started the meeting, we said, do you mind if we start from the back point first? Everyone looked at me thinking I was a bit strange, but they said, yeah, okay, we'll do that. And there was a particular reason I wanted to do that, and that was the first 2 or 3 points were the areas that we were the most problematic for us. So what I wanted to do was keep giving to council in what they wanted. So most of the things they asked for we were fine with. So we got to the point where after about half an hour, 45 minutes of giving to council for 45 minutes, we then said, okay, now point 3, point 2, point 1, these are the areas we want you to give to us a bit. So it strengthened our negotiation position a bit because we'd given so much in areas that didn't really matter to the project so much.
Very good tactic. I like your thinking.
And whether it worked or not, I'll never know, but I tend to think it did, and we got a good outcome, so the client was pretty stoked.
Oh, that's good. Well, I guess we could make jokes about short attention spans then of council planners, and by the time they got to those top points, they were thinking about their tea and biscuits.
Maybe, I don't know, but it was probably one of the more bizarre strategies I've ever sort of seen or used.
Now, what about some success stories?
Probably the one that comes to mind recently, we had a project whereby there's a particular suburb that we do development in, and there's a lot of unformed roads, and council just hasn't got the budget to build those roads. So we were doing a particular development, and there's a few little problems with the project. And I think what had happened, I don't know exactly, but I think what had happened was that the councillor in the area said, if we don't support these guys with this project, we're never going to get these roads built, and we're never going to have an opportunity to get the roads built. So they invited us in for a meeting with somewhat of no agenda, which we thought was strange. And they put their cards on the table and said, guys, this is the situation we're in. No one here's going to build these roads, and we need to motivate you to build the road for us. And if you do that for us, we'll let you pretty much do what you want on this site. Let's talk about that. And they're going to waive fees. They bent over backwards. So I guess the point there is that if you're in a situation where you can give to council in a way they really need to know what they really need, sometimes you can get really great outcomes. In this particular client, effectively what they originally applied for, they added about 40% to the yield they were originally going for. And that we subdivided in a particular way. He was a first-time developer, which blew me away. He's going to do so well. It's just fantastic. So that's getting a higher yield than expected, and what he's done on his feasibility is a really great outcome. But also, what's kind of cool is that this guy, we asked if he could name the road. If we're going to build the road, we want to name the road. And council said, yep, we can do that. And this guy sadly lost a friend of his about 2 weeks prior to that, who died, and he decided to call the road after his mate who'd passed away. So it's a really touching story that our developer had named this road after a friend of his as a tribute, but also he got a great outcome as well. So that's certainly a heartwarming story, not only for us, but obviously for him as well.
See, developers do add to the fabric of the local community. They're good people.
Yeah. That was a great story. Other stories, like I think good story. This will sound strange, but good stories for me is when I convince someone not to buy a site which they're about to buy. And what I mean by that, I hate seeing people lose money, and I hate seeing people struggle through their first developments. And if they're about to go unconditional on a property that there's a problem they didn't recognise, for me just to be able to bring to their attention something they didn't know that would have stopped them from developing, I get a kick out of that, because it means that their first project wasn't a disaster, and it means hopefully they'll go on and find a good one, and they'll keep doing more developing.
And so with the developers that you've dealt with over the years, what are the kind of qualities that you see in the good ones that seem to consistently get pretty solid results?
There's probably a few things that come to mind. And the first thing that comes to mind is they've always got a really strong team around them, and they lean on their team. And what I mean by that is if there's something that I constantly see with first-time developers, they feel like they need to do it all by themselves. They need to work out the solution to every problem. The really good ones typically just hand the problems to their team, and say, you show me how we can solve this, and I'll buy this property. If we can't, I won't buy it. So they're good at having a good team around them. But also, I think what they're really good at is their doggedness. I've certainly got one client that comes to mind, and that I think he must stay awake all night long, because every day I'll call back with a new solution, and just the doggedness of his desire to solve the problem, and just not letting any stone be unturned to try and find solutions. The ones that I think who have great people skills, because ultimately property development is very much around working with people, whether it be real estate agents, developers, town planners or council planners. So they've got those good skills. But I do property development courses myself a little bit. And I keep talking about the most simplistic thing is that if we don't really know why we're doing development in the first place, and we haven't got that burning passion for why we want to do a development, there'll be enough problems that get in the way for us to say, oh, it's too hard, I can't be bothered, it's too many problems. So the ones that I see who are really successful have a really, whether it be they want to buy a beautiful house or a car or have more time with their families or whatever. So it gets back to those core values of why they're developing in the first place and getting real about what they are.
Yes, that's true. I would agree with that, particularly with the purpose. You really need to know why you're doing it, because you get so many roadblocks thrown up or hurdles that you have to overcome. And then the people skill stuff is an absolute must. You're just dealing with so many different people every day. You just got to be able to motivate or inspire them to get the job done.
Absolutely. And the ones, and adding to that, some of our clients, like some of my clients, I just find myself getting more personally invested in, and they're the ones I get really grateful for the work we do for them. So the more grateful and more gratitude they have for their team around them, and more they trust in their team, it's almost like the more I will want to make them happy, if that kind of makes sense. So therefore, I want to look after the ones that look after us as well. So things like, don't expect that you think you'll pay every bill really late, and then people will fall over backwards to do work for you tomorrow when you need it in a hurry. So I guess it's just looking after your consultants and your team as well.
Yes. Well, let's flip the coin then. What are the things about developers that you find frustrating or that cause you issues?
Yeah, probably the couple of issues I come up with is the ones that just won't listen. And what I mean by that, sometimes I'm like, I can see them, I can see a train wreck about to happen. And I'm trying to tell them, and it's like I tell them so many different ways that what they're doing I think is not going to work, but they just don't listen. And then despite my best attempts to try and stop them from getting in the way of this train, it's like almost they're committed to not listening to people around them and walk in front of the train. Now, usually you can try and stop them in time, but I find that extremely frustrating. What other things do I find frustrating? I guess that's probably the major thing. They don't listen to good advice, and it can be given from multiple points, and they still won't listen to it. I don't have too many frustrations with clients, to be honest. Maybe I'm quite fortunate, but they're probably the areas that can frustrate me the most.
Okay. Now, if you could go back in time and talk to yourself,
yep.
At what age or point would you go back to, and what would you tell yourself? And why?
Wow, that's a heavy question. Jeez, didn't expect that one. Well, I don't know what age. I guess being a young boy, I would tell myself that everything works out fine in the end. Just have faith and trust in the process, because I've had plenty of ups and downs, and it seems to always work out all right in the end, which is good advice. I'm listening to that advice myself right now, because I think we don't always. I personally sometimes think when things aren't going well, like, why aren't they going well? What am I doing wrong? And get a bit down on myself. So I think I just have faith in the bigger picture that ultimately everything's happening for a greater good, and if I just go on the flow with that, things will work out well. That's a heavy question, mate. I wasn't expecting something like that.
To keep you on your toes, make sure that you're still listening.
So I want to ask you the same question.
Yes, good one. I think it would be some stage in my early 20s. And I would have told myself to stay. I remember being back in my early 20s and thinking that I wanted to do something in business, but it took me about 15 years to finally get around to doing it. So I think if I'd got started sooner and started doing some more more personal development and learning more about myself, that would have been beneficial. I would have accelerated where I've gotten to. And I think the advice I would have given would have been that that you are just fine the way you are. You don't have any shortcomings. There's nothing wrong with you, and you can go out and achieve whatever you want to achieve.
I like that. Lots of wisdom there. That's a good one.
Yeah. So if only we could go back in time. I probably would have told myself a couple of the horses that were going to win the Melbourne Cup. Or... Sure,
that would help. Or the winning lotto numbers. Yeah, definitely.
Oh, I know. Actually, I know what I would have said. I would have said, go and buy these particular sites for about a fifth of what they're probably worth today.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, there you go. You caught me off guard there. I wasn't expecting you to turn that around on me.
On that point, I do a lot of personal development as well. So I think that's a huge part of success. And I think for anyone developing, it's like, what gets in their way is themselves a lot of the times. So all of my good clients that are achieving big goals, they very much work on themselves as well.
Yeah, tell us a little bit more about that, about the clients that you've got that it's sort of go on and do what other people would probably describe as amazing things, but they just sort of see it as just part of the journey.
I think that it's like we expect a lot in a year. I think a lot of people want to change the world in a year. So I think there's a saying, you overestimate what you can do in 12 months, but underestimate what you can do in 10 years. And I think those that consistently have a long-term goal, that being a 5 to 10 year goal, and just keep making progress towards that long-term goal without it being a ridiculously out there type goal. It's always nice to get excited. I'm going to make $1 million in a year. And that's a great goal, but it's kind of very much out there. Versus the people who have said, in 5 years I want to quit my job and have enough income from property developing to replace my income. And the people who I see successful are those ones who, like the locomotive, once they start building up a steam engine full of steam, they just keep on going even when things aren't going so well. So it's that long-term stability that seems to work for those guys.
Okay. What about any influential books that stand out for you that have perhaps made an impact on your life that might be of interest to developers out there?
Yeah, most of the books I really like aren't property developing books. They're actually personal development books. And for me, Rich Dad, Poor Dad was a classic. They kind of opened my eyes up a long, long time ago. I could just ramble off so many books that I think are, Think and Grow Rich is one that comes to mind. All those sorts of books about mindset.
The classics.
They are. I really love the old stuff. I like the books that have, like Earl Nightingale, The Stranger's Secret. If you ever YouTube that, it's old. It's like 1940s old, but it's just pure and it's just great personal development stuff. And I really enjoy it because it's not. No one's trying to put their angle on it. It's like these days everyone's got to have a different angle on personal development. Where back then I was just pure, and I really enjoy the old stuff.
Okay, very good. I'll go and check that out. All right. You've given us lots of tips, but have you got any final one for property developers out there to help them ensure that they either succeed or that they get their planning permits? Yeah,
I think I'll relate a story here because I think it's the easiest way is get serious and get real about it. I think what happens is a lot of us, I speak even on behalf of myself, I was doing a 5-lot subdivision project here about 5 years ago. And even though I knew the project looked like it was going to work, I needed to use a finance partner, so it was a bit tricky. I knew it was going to work, but I wasn't being real or being serious. I hadn't made that commitment that I was going to make it work. And there's people out there who I think saying that they're saying to themselves, I'm going to be a property developer, but they haven't got their finances sorted out yet. They're sort of dabbling. And even if a really good deal fell in their lap, they probably find a way of making a mess of it. So I guess what I'm saying is if you get real about it and have your exit strategies like your due diligence periods or your cooling off periods, but you can never learn faster than when you actually have to know the answer. And the reason you have to know the answer is because you've just put a contract on a property and you have to know whether you can subdivide it or you have to know whether you can do this many townhouses. So I would say jump off the fence, make sure you got your safety blankets in place, jump off the fence and get yourself surrounded by really good people, mentors or people involved in those sorts of projects, and actually put some skin in the game because that's where you're really going to learn.
Okay, very good. Well, where can people find out more about you, Craig, if they're interested?
Yeah, definitely. So a few things would be visit our webpage, which is www.asiplanning.com.au. So, and that's our webpage. My email address is the same, but it's just craig@asiplanning.com.au. And our phone number, which is in Queensland, is 07 3555 8654. And that would be the best ways and easiest ways to get in contact with us.
All right, fantastic. Well, thank you for sharing all your tips and insights on how town planners can help property developers be more successful. It is a really critical part of the process and one that can be frustrating, except when you get that stamp for what you want and then it's time to celebrate.
But there's one last thing I should share with you. I'm actually in the process of making something right now, which is a one-page checklist for property developers. What it's designed to do is it's designed they can use it at home, looking at sites and the information on council's web-based planning tools, but also on site to try and bring to people's attention aspects of the development that may be problematic. So I'll be finishing that fairly soon. So if that's of any value to either yourself or your listeners, if they'd like a copy of that and the link to some audios to how to use them, I'm more than happy to offer that to your listeners as well.
So, yep, that'd be great. If you send me through your details, I can put it on the show notes for this episode. Otherwise, I presume at some stage it'll go up on the ASI Planning website.
Yeah,
People
it will.
can go there and try and find it.
That's it. It should be about probably another 2 or 3 weeks' time I'll have that finished.
Perfect. All right. Well, we'll look forward to seeing that resource. Always nice to have checklists. All right, Craig, we'll let you get back to whatever it is town planners do.
Very good. Thank you. I really appreciate the chance to have a chat with you today.
It's been fantastic talking to you. Thanks for being on the Property Developer Podcast.
Thank you.
See you, Craig.
Okay, there you go. I thought that was a great discussion with Craig about planning. I know the planning part of a development can be very frustrating, particularly when council are not really happy with the direction you want to go in, or are trying to get you to scale down. But it is one of the most important parts of the game. Get your planning permit and you are one step closer to finishing. However, if you get a good designer on your team and potentially a great private town planner, you will give yourself the best shot of getting something that you are happy with. I took quite a few points out of the discussion with Craig, including these. 1. Use a town planner who has experience in your type of projects and understands the council you are dealing with. Make sure if you are using a private town planner that they have the relevant experience working on similar projects as yours, and that they have a track record of success. I think it is also worth asking the planner how many similar types of projects he may have worked on which have failed to get a permit. You also need to find someone who is good at negotiating and communicating with council officers, as they are your key representative through planning. 2. Confirm verbally at meetings with council what has been agreed and follow up with written notes. I think this should become standard practice for your designers and town planners so that everyone in the meeting is clear on what was agreed. And by following it up with an email, you also have a written trail of what took place. These notes won't always help if council subsequently changes its mind, but at least you can show at a later date, if you need to, that council changed direction, not you. 3. Be smart with your concessions to council. I liked Craig's tactic of starting out with all the small points that you're willing to concede, and working backwards to the biggest issues that you want council to show some flexibility on. I think this is a good idea, and certainly can't hurt. People do become aware when they feel they are doing all the taking, and you can harness this to work in your favour. Give it a try and see if it works. Alright, that's pretty much it for this show. If you want to check out my latest project video, head over to propertydeveloperpodcast.com and check out the show notes. You can also find all the past episodes there too. And join me on Instagram at Property Developer Podcast for my property developer porn pics and development videos. Thanks again for listening in, and until next time, may all your town planning applications be speedily approved.
You've been listening to the Property Developer Podcast. Tune in next time for more tips, ideas and inspiration to take your developing to the next level. For more developing love, make sure to visit propertydeveloperpodcast.com.